Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." Then Peter and the other disciple set out and went toward the tomb. The two were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent down to look in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen wrappings lying there, and the cloth that had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen wrappings, but rolled up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple who reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed, for as yet they did not understand the scripture, that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples returned to their homes. But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white, sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and the other at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." When she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you looking for?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not hold on to me, because I have not yet ascended to my Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. Thank you. Now it's Vera. Thank you.
My name is Mary. I come from Magdala on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. Until Herod Antipas built Tiberias, Magdala was the biggest and richest city for miles around. My father used to love to say he was a farmer, and he was, of sorts, if you count strolling around his 3 vineyards and 2 olive groves, issuing orders to the slaves and sending his 100 sheep out with their shepherds as farming. I used to love watching the shepherd boys calling their sheep in the morning. The boys would come in the first light of dawn, 10 or so of them, and stand outside the pen and call and call. The sheep would come flocking out, jostling round their shepherds, recognizing their voices and ready for the day's journey to find grass. Then one day, when I woke up, the world felt different. I felt different. I felt hazy and distant, as though a veil had settled over my mind. I would walk for miles and miles, restless and ill at ease. They told me I had evil spirits in me, though even that I couldn't take in. I just wanted to be alone, far away from the noise and the clamour of people around me. Once, when I'd been out walking off my restlessness, I met a man sitting on the shores of the lake, talking to a large crowd of people. Something came over me. I knew I was talking, shouting and shaking, though I'd no idea what I was saying. And then, all of a sudden, a wave of peace washed over me. The veil lifted, and I was myself again, The man, Jesus, they said his name was, smiled at me and signaled to the people around him that I should sit at his feet like a real disciple. I held back for a moment. It wasn't seemly for a woman, but he signaled again, and I couldn't resist. So I sat and I listened and listened with the whole of my being. He was talking about being the good shepherd and calling his sheep and them knowing his voice and following him. I smiled at that bit. I knew how true that was. But then when he talked about knowing the sheep by name and calling their names, I chuckled to myself. He'd clearly never been around sheep much. I mean, who in their right mind gives a sheep a name? It was a nice idea, though. From that moment on, I followed him. Me and a number of other women like Susanna and Joanna and a handful of other Marys. So I was there when they killed him. We women, clinging together in horror as the unthinkable happened before our eyes. We watched where they buried him, hastily because the sun had begun to dip below the horizon, announcing the start of the Sabbath day. We sat together that day, barely moving or speaking. The shock had rendered us senseless. Then, as the sun dipped again, marking the end of the Sabbath, I sprang to life. We had to do something. We'd agreed between us that we'd return to anoint his body for burial. My first thought was the others, the male disciples. Anointing a man's body after death was a man's job. Perhaps they'd like to know where he was laid. I found out where they were staying and hurried round. "Who is it?" an anxious voice shouted in response to my frantic knocking. "Mary from Magdala," I answered. The door opened a crack. "What are you doing here? They might find us." James' anxious face peered out. "Who?" I asked, bemused. "The Romans. They always kill the followers after the leader." I pushed my way in, but soon saw there was little hope in it. The terror in that room was palpable. Peter sat in the corner, rocking and weeping. "He's been like that ever since Thursday evening," James said sadly. "We can't get a word out of him." I returned home disheartened, my mind spinning. How on earth was I going to find myrrh and aloes enough to anoint his body in a city I didn't live in? When I got back, I told the others what had happened. "I wish I'd kept my jar of nard now," said Susanna wretchedly. "I'd no idea we'd need it so soon." "Sweet girl," Jesus' mother said from across the room, stirring herself from her grief-ridden stupor. "You honoured him in life. No gift is greater than that. We'll find the spices we need." She was right. We did. We spread out across the city, begging, borrowing, and buying what we could. In the early morning, when we met together and compared our haul, we had, we thought, just about enough. We went, carrying large water jars between us to bathe his poor battered body before anointing it. By the time we got near the place where the tomb was, the sun had just risen, casting eerie early morning shadows over the whole area. We'd been talking as we went about how we'd move the stone that they'd rolled across the entrance. "That's strange," Salome said as we approached. "The way the shadows fall makes it look as though the stone has gone." We looked, all of us straining to see through the early morning light. That's because it has, said James' mother. Our footsteps faltered, but then started again. We couldn't bear to see what had happened now, but also we couldn't bear not to see. We peeped in through the entrance, and there, right inside the tomb, sitting as comfortable as you like, was a young man, his robe gleaming white. "Don't be alarmed," he said. Salome let out a sound, halfway between a laugh and a scream. "He's not here. He's been raised. Go tell the disciples, especially Peter. Tell them he's going ahead of them to Galilee." We turned and ran. We ran and ran and ran, dropping the water and the carefully gathered spices as we went, never pausing for breath until we reached the safety of our rented room. In the end, I did tell Peter and the other disciple. I broke into his room weeping with the news of another disaster. Now, on top of everything, they'd taken his body as well. The shock of it was enough to jolt Peter from his misery, and they ran back with me to see the empty tomb. They got there first. Their legs were longer than mine. By the time I arrived panting and out of breath, they'd seen for themselves that his body was gone, the linen wrapping lying there empty. After they left, I stood outside the tomb for a while, my eyes blinded with tears, wondering whether I could salvage some of the ointment we'd dropped in our terror a few hours earlier. I leaned against the entrance and let my grief and weariness take hold of me. After a while, I felt the overwhelming urge to look in the tomb one more time. So I bent and looked in. The young man had now been joined by someone else, and they were sitting at either end of the ledge. "Why are you crying?" they asked. I'd opened my mouth to answer when a voice behind me asked the same question. "Why are you crying?" A tumble of words burst out of me. When I told people about this later, I tidied up my words into a coherent, comprehensible sentence. But the reality is I babbled on in a tide of tears and snot about my Lord and his body, and it's gone, and I don't know where, and I didn't know what to do. He waited quietly for my gibbering to fade away. And then he said just one word. "Mary." The Good Shepherd had called my name, and I knew his voice with every fibre of my being. Later, people would ask us, those of us who'd met the risen Christ, what he said that had made us believe it was really him. Thomas would tell his story of Jesus' wounds and of being asked to put his hands in them. Peter would tell his story of Jesus asking if he loved him. And then they'd look at me. "Mary met him first," they'd say. "What did he say to you?" they'd ask. "He said, Mary," I'd tell them. "Is that all? Did he say anything else?" They'd look a bit disappointed. But I wasn't. Not for one moment.
Be still for the presence of the Lord, the Holy One is here. is shining all around. He burns with holy fire, with splendor he is crowned. How awesome is the sight, our radiant King of light. Be still, for the glory of the Lord is shining all around. Be still, for the power of the Lord is moving in this place. He comes to cleanse and heal, to minister his grace. No word too hard for him, in faith receive from him. Be still, for the power of the Lord is moving in this place. In him no sin is found. We stand on holy ground. Be still, for the presence of the Lord, the Holy One is here. The Holy One is here.
Thanks, Steve.
Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They went to the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near to the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it's almost evening and the day is nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at table with them, he took bread, blessed it and broke it and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of bread.
Thank you, Annie.
My name is Mary. No, not the one you're thinking of. Not the mother of Jesus, oh no, not that one either. Not Mary Magdalene. There's so many of us Marys and Miriams around, it's easy to get confused. I am Mary, the one who's married to Cleopas. I was there at the crucifixion, holding up Jesus' mother Mary as a sword pierced her soul, brutal inch by brutal inch. Today, we were walking home to Emmaus. When I say walking, it was more like dragging ourselves. More than once, I felt like lying down on the edge of the road and never moving again. I don't think I've ever felt so weary and hopeless in all my life. I don't really know what I'd been expecting. But it wasn't this. Jesus was the kind of person who gave you such hope in him, in the world, in yourself. And I knew that I could just be near him. That hope would grow and grow and never stop. We had hoped that he would redeem Israel. Now I think about it, I'm not really sure what I thought that meant. He didn't have the look to be a military leader. I don't mean he was all meek and mild. He could rage with the best of them and did often. It was more that brandishing a sword wasn't his style. I suppose I imagined the whole host of heaven would come down and drive out the Romans, as in stories of old. I realize how daft it sounds now I say it out loud, but I did believe he could. I did believe he would. So this morning, after everything that had happened, we packed our bags and went home. I thought it was a bit soon. But on that long, awful day on Friday, I watched my hope ebb away with every dying breath he took. And then the women came this morning to tell us the tomb was empty, saying something harebrained about him being risen from the dead. And we'd rushed outside and seen the world exactly as it had always been, Roman soldiers and all. The fight went out of me and we packed up and left. It was Cleopas who started the row. He started by grumbling that I'd been the one to follow that Jesus in the first place. And if it hadn't been for me, he'd have been comfortable at home right now. That did it. I let him have it all my pent-up anger and hurt and bitterness spewed out over him in a massive tidal wave. I was taking a breath for the second wave when I became aware of a stranger just standing there, smiling at us, asking what we were talking about. Cleopas glared at him in disbelief. Are you the only one who has no idea what has been going on? The stranger smiled again. Maybe I am. Why don't you tell me about it while we walk? And so we did. Turn and turn about. We told him about our hopes and our fears, about Jesus and what he meant to us. Strange though he was, I found myself telling him things I'd never imagined saying out loud. We even told him about the story the women had told this morning, about him being alive. He listened and nodded and listened and nodded. Then suddenly he said, "How stupid you are and slow to catch on." I thought it was a bit rude, frankly. But then he began telling us about the scriptures, and I forgot to be annoyed. Starting at the very beginning, he laid it all out. He told my story, all my hopes and my dreams in the words of the scriptures. My heart leapt and burned within me. I was so totally and utterly absorbed that I was amazed to hear him saying, "Look, your village is just down there. I'll leave you here and travel on." We had traveled 7 miles, it felt, in an instant. All of a sudden, I couldn't bear the thought that this stranger might leave us. It felt as though I'd known him all my life. It seemed Cleopas felt the same. So we begged and cajoled, pleaded, and persuaded him to eat with us. Eventually, he gave in, and he came with us. I brought food back from us from Jerusalem, so it was only a matter of minutes before we were ready to eat. It was, I remember thinking, a bit forward of him to take the bread and bless it. That was Clopas' job as a host. But the thought had gone as soon as it half formed in my mind. The arms of the man's tunic slipped downwards as he raised his hands, revealing gaping holes in each wrist. And the words of blessing and gratitude to his Father in heaven, were words I'd heard every single day for the past few years, words he'd said every time he took bread and blessed it. I looked at the bread in my hand, and in that moment, I knew it was him. He's alive. He is alive. He is alive. Cleopas' mouth formed the words faster than mine did. But he was gone, the loaf falling to the plate with a crash. We sprang to our feet and ran quicker than I could have ever imagined was possible, our feet beating out to the rhythm as we went. He's alive. He's alive. He's alive. We arrived in Jerusalem, hot and breathless. "I thought you went home," said Peter. Voices round the room chimed in. "So did we. Well, you might have said goodbye. You can't go off just like that." I was still panting, trying to catch my breath, unable to speak. "We've got news," said Peter. Mary, yes, that one, the one you were thinking about, Jesus' mother, spoke quietly, but her voice cut through all the hubbub. "If you give them a moment, I think you'll find they have too."
Thank you so much, everybody, this evening. Thank you for the readings. They were lovely. And do join us for our last part in this series, which will be on Friday evening, on Good Friday, when we'll be hearing from Mary, the Mother of Jesus. Thanks, everybody. See you soon. God bless. Night, night. Bye-bye.